This is Akashvani. In the weekly program Current Affairs, now we bring a discussion on Voice of Global South Summit, the successful outcomes of G20 Summit 2023. The participants are Anil Wadhwa, former diplomat, Professor Swarn Singh from JNU, and Manash Pratim Bhuyan, journalist.
Ambassador Wadhwa, in the last few years, India has been positioning itself as a leading voice, flagging concerns, challenges, and aspirations of the global south or the developing nations, especially the African continent. As the G20 president, India has been focusing on issues like inclusive growth, digital innovation, climate resilience, infrastructure, equitable global health access, with an aim to benefit the global south, which are the countries we call developing countries. So, weeks after taking over the presidency of the G20, India hosted the first edition of the virtual Voice of the Global South Summit under the theme Unity of Voice, Unity of Purpose on January 12th and 13th, with a view to highlight issues relating to global south. And in a significant milestone under India's G20 presidency, the African Union in September became the new permanent member of the grouping of the largest economies of the world, the first expansion of G20 since its inception in 1999. And today, India hosted the second Voice of Global South Summit, during which Prime Minister Narendra Modi apprised the leaders attending it about achievements of G20 and which would have really helped the global south. How do you see Prime Minister Narendra Modi's priorities for the global south, Ambassador Wadhwa?
So I think, as you said, India has worked to ensure that the concerns of the global south receive due cognizance and that the priorities of the global south are duly factored in finding solutions to the most pressing global challenges. And second, Voice of the Global South Summit today, in fact, focuses on sharing with countries of the global south the key outcomes which we achieved in the various G20 meetings over the course of India's presidency, but also the challenges that are posed by global developments, which the global south is most affected with. Again, because this summit has been divided into 10 sessions, so it serves as a useful platform to discuss ways to sustain the momentum that has been generated towards our aspiration of a inclusive and a representative and a progressive world order. So, as the theme of the session suggests, it is together for everyone's growth with everyone's trust. This was the theme of the inaugural leaders session today, which Prime Minister Modi part in and inaugurated. And the concluding leader session is Global South Together for One Future. And that sums it up aptly, because what is actually required through this Voice of the Global South Summit is to make sure that we galvanize the Global South towards self-reliance so that they can mitigate their own vulnerabilities vis-a-vis economic concentrations, and that any problems which arise in the world which are disruptive, they should be able to overcome those problems on their own. Because we are actually seeing that there is a resistance, as External Affairs Minister pointed out, for a greater role for the Global South in shaping the solutions for key issues of our times. And when we look forward and we look ahead, as far as India is concerned, the vision of everyone's growth with everyone's trust is far from accomplished. So change, of course, is a natural. There continues to be resistance, however, to the role of the Global South in shaping the solutions. But India wants to bring together the Global South and so that they can put greater emphasis on the need to take everyone along, and everybody's views are taken when we look at the multilateral and plurilateral forums, etc. And that's the main aim which this summit is planning to achieve.
Professor Singh, in his opening remarks at the second edition of the Voice of Global South Summit, Prime Minister Narendra Modi also highlighted the forward movement at the G20 on several initiatives which were pushed by India to benefit the global south. The Prime Minister particularly described the Voice of Global South as the most unique platform reflecting the changing world order of 21st century. Prime Minister Modi said India's priority has been to make the G20 inclusive and human-centric on a global scale, and India's effort was that the focus of G20 should be development of the people, by the people, and for the people. How do you see this vision and what could be the road ahead?
Manas, let me say that I think it's a very apt description by Prime Minister of India in his opening address to the second Voice of Global South Summit, where he said that Global South represents today a unique platform reflecting the transformation that is occurring in global order of 21st century. And I think, therefore, it is very significant for our listeners to understand why is Global South so significant, or what is the fuss about Global South. Very quickly, if I can recall history, the world till about Second World War was largely organized in terms of great European powers and their colonies. And it is 1940s and 1950s that saw an enormous explosive wave of decolonization, and world was now becoming much more fluid and disruptive. So you had an academic, Alfred Sauvy, an American academic, who in 1952 created a category called First World, Second World, and Third World. He divided Western industrialized nations as First World, socialist countries as Second World, and recently decolonizing poor, deindustrialized countries of Asia, Africa, Latin America as Third World. Now, when Soviet Union collapsed in late 1980s, early 1990s, the Second World disappeared. Now, there was again a fluid situation, whether there is no Second World. Meanwhile, in 1969, another American academic, Carl Oglesby, had created another term called Global South. He described this as a hierarchical relationship between Global North, that was imperial powers, and Global South, which was now decolonizing but former colonies. So it was a hierarchical relationship. Global South, what I'm saying is, to begin with, was a negative, a pejorative term. But as I said, Soviet Union collapsed and there was whole change in Global South. Countries like China and India were emerging as major economic powers. Even the distinction between developed, developing, and least developed countries has become unacceptable. So Global South in that sense represents 140 plus countries that are rapidly transforming themselves. But in international decision making, they have stayed on the margins. Largely G7 have been controlling, leading global governance. And then, of course, it has now expanded to global G-20. That is where India's effort is to be a bridge and bring together the Global South, which has always remained on the margins. Bringing African Union to G20 meeting and making it a 21st member was a great success. So that the strategies of G7 that have not delivered and had led the world in all kinds of crises of climate, of terrorism, of refugees, and so on, it must take decisions that are holistic. Entire world sits together in unison and takes decisions and implements them. And therefore, as Prime Minister said in today's address, Global South represents and reflects the changing transformation of global order. And India wants to be an important catalyst in bridging that. The Global North, which is the dominating economies, and of course the Global South. And it is also very interesting to see that both China and India are actually north of the equator largely. And countries like Australia and New Zealand, which are seen part of North, are still south of equator in that sense. So it's the last point I'm making is Global South is not a geographical definition, it's a geopolitical definition. And I think this whole transformation where Global South is joining now the Global North and taking holistic decisions to implement and really deal with challenges that are global, climate change, terrorism, and others, is where India becoming a catalyst in doing that transformation is what makes India very special. And the fact that India is hosting the second summit within the same year shows India's hyperactive and very, very active leadership in pushing that transformation in coming years. And it will see India's imprint on G20 summit meetings in the coming years, particularly because Global South is going to lead the presidencies of G20 meetings. After India, it is Brazil, then South Africa, which is also called IBSA. India has had this triangular relationship. So the transformation that India is making will be enduring in my understanding. And I think that is a unique role India is playing in bringing the world together.
Ambassador Wadhwa, it's a very well established fact now that India played a key role in entry of African Union, 55 nation African Union into the G20 format, making it the permanent member of the G20. And the Prime Minister today actually highlighted that and he said, I quote, I cannot forget that historic moment when the African Union was inducted into G20 as a permanent member with India's efforts. And we also know that Prime Minister Modi personally, he had written to all the G20 leaders requesting them to support India's proposal to make African Union a permanent member of the G20. So what is the significance of African Union's entry into G20 as a permanent member? Does it reflect a new world order or as it came in the midst of geopolitical turmoil that we have been witnessing? So what is the significance of African Union's entry into G20 and what are the outcomes that we can expect from a global body like G20 in the near future?
So, India has always believed that it's important to carry all countries of the global south together in any decision making that happens around the world, especially where the developed countries are present. Africa is seen as a new frontier for development around the world because Africa has not yet realized its full potential. It has got many countries which have a lot of promise, but at the same time, they have not been able to exploit their own resources, for instance, and they have not been able to stand on their own feet because of the dominance of the developed countries in the past, which dominated Africa. A leftover legacy, one can call it, from the colonial times. And despite decolonization, there are still a number of dependencies which have been left behind. So it is important that this gap between the global north and the global south, especially as far as Africa is concerned, does not widen further. Also, we are seeing that today in the world there is a time of technology change. Technology, for example, there is a move now to make sure that technology is used responsibly, something which India has been talking about for a very long time. But we are now seeing the spread of artificial intelligence. And that is why India is also, I think this is linked also to the fact that Africa is now part of the G20, which India pushed for, because it wanted Africa to have a voice in decision making, especially in terms of the AI Global Partnership Summit, which India is organizing next month. Now, the priority of G20 under India was to make G20 inclusive and human centric. And that is why Prime Minister Modi ensured that there were more than 200 G20 meetings held across India during the year, in which all aspects of and concerns of the developing world, especially the African countries, were also taken into account. And India took it upon itself to, as a responsibility, to raise the voice of the global south because it wanted the G20 to become inclusive and human centric. And with this objective, when the first Voice of Global South Summit was organized, we saw a lot of African countries finding their voice and expressing their concerns on different issues, which India gave voice to in turn during the G20 summit. So that is why Prime Minister Modi made a special effort for the inclusion of the African Union as a permanent member of the G20. And this is what he calls the historic moment because it was not without some amount of struggle that this actually happened. But for global prosperity, what he calls Sabka Saath and Sabka Vikas is the paramount issue. And we are all seeing that the world is facing a lot of challenges, emerging challenges from events which are happening around the world. It is very important, therefore, to carry the African countries in particular together in any decision making which happens at a global scale in a plurilateral forum, which also affects them. If that is not done, then they will definitely be left behind. There will be a gap which will occur, and that is not for anybody's good.
Professor Singh, we have seen the New Delhi G20 leaders declaration has 83 paragraphs and it contains 87 outcomes and it has an attachment of around 112 odd documents. And all these were actually adopted with consensus. So during its presidency, India has been pushing for digital public infrastructure. India has been pushing for inclusive economic growth. India has been pushing for climate finance. So, what, according to you, are the topmost outcomes that emerge from the Indian presidency of the G20 that would benefit the global south?
Very clearly, Manas, the first big change that Ambassador Anil Wadhwa also referred to as historic change is the bringing of African Union as a permanent member into G20, which is now G21. Now, if you look at the fact that European Union also sits as a 20th member, now G21 summits or meetings will involve nearly 100 countries being represented in that forum. That kind of change has not been easy to come by, but is going to really bring Global South to the center stage, have direct conversations with what is known as G7, most developed countries sitting on the same table and discussing issues that concern Global South as well. So that's a first fundamental change. Second most important change is the whole pace of India's presidency. You just noticed that this is the second Voice of Global South Summit meeting happening. India is on 22nd of this month, November, also organizing the second virtual summit of the global G21, which is going to be second summit meeting under India's presidency. So what India is doing today in the Global South Summit meeting is to have 4 parallel sessions before lunch and 4 parallel sessions after lunch, where India's ministers, finance, foreign affairs, environment, energy, IT, health, education, are going to really share what they have achieved in this largest leaders' declaration ever of the G20 summit meeting of September. And not just share what has been achieved in terms of building consensus, but also take their feedback. Because soon we'll have, on 22nd of this month, the online virtual G21 summit as well. So that is kind of detailed exercise which is being again conducted with a motive to ensure that India remains constantly in touch with global South nations and brings their voice to the G21 summit meetings. Third, I think most significant initiatives could be several in that sense. As you said, largest ever leaders declaration produced. And remember, it was announced at end of the very first session. Usually summit meetings have to extend their last sessions to build consensus and have a declaration. Sometimes declarations don't even come about. But let me specifically say, particularly issues where India has really been trying to emphasize is to underline that world is one, that it is one family, it is one future, and our challenges are all shared, and therefore our response has to be shared. And within that, for example, making the whole new template of technology sharing. India is offering its digital public infrastructure platforms virtually for free, anyone who wants to take. India is setting a whole new template as to how technology should be shared among nations. Second, for example, one could talk about not just women development, but women-led development. Within India, from 2018, Prime Minister has been very focused on each of the ministries focusing on women-led development. Now, he's taking that template to the global level. You could also talk of several other initiatives. For example, the Global Biofuels Coalition is another major initiative to deal with the energy transition, not just energy security, energy transition. India has presented an action plan for multilateral development banks to be reformed, which again need to become representative and need to really therefore effective to take the voice of global South. So one could go on talking about so many things, dozens and dozens of firsts that India's presidency has brought about during its presidency of G21. And I think throughout those various initiatives, India has ensured bringing global South to the center stage of global governance, global decision making, in which now, of course, G21 is the most influential, most powerful forum. Because as we say, it represents 85% of global GDP, 75% of global trade, 2/3 of global population, but also in terms of problems, 80% of emission of CO2. So, this is a very powerful forum. And if you can see this forum getting increasingly engaged with global South, which is where countries have suffered much more. These are countries that have been really least responsible for things like climate change, and they're the worst affected in terms of outcome of the climate change. And if they are to be brought on board and their voices, their strategies, their traditions have to be really taken into account in making decisions how these challenges have to be met. Hopefully, such a holistic approach is going to help us much better. And that is where I think India is playing a kind of a yeoman service, a very, very pioneering role in that sense, in becoming a catalyst in ensuring that bridging of developed and the global south countries, so that holistic approach to dealing with global problems can be dealt with. And the kind of exhaustive exercise that India has gone through, including, for example, the 10 sessions in today's summit, is a reflection of India's commitment to ensuring that transformation.
Mr. Badua, in his remarks at one of the ministerial sessions, External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar called on countries of the global south to work towards self-reliance to mitigate vulnerabilities and economic concentrations. So you also briefly mentioned about it. Mr. Jaishankar, he also talked about how COVID era was a stark reminder of the perils of dependence for basic necessities for faraway geographies. So would you please explain actually, in fact, the significance of these comments and in fact, who are the forces which are resisting, a greater role for global south in the world order?
So I think it is a natural resistance which is arising because of the fact that the voice of the global south has traditionally been suppressed. And that is why the External Affairs Minister reminded everyone present that when there is a issue which arises with regard to basic survival, as it happened during the COVID-19 era, it is then that you realize that the perils of dependency get magnified. And when you don't even get basic necessities. It was during that time, if you remember, that India helped more than 100 countries with very essential vaccines. It helped them with medical aid, with food aid, and also any other kind of assistance that they required in days of crisis. But that has taught a lesson to everyone in the global south that if you depend on others and you do not stand on your own feet, then these kinds of situations can arise in the future as well. So it was in this context that he actually raised this issue. And this call was for them to unite to work towards self-reliance so that they can get out of vulnerability situations by collaborating together between each other and making sure that the supply chains are not dependent on one or two or other countries and that there are options which are available to them. Now, there are various ways to do that, of course, but in terms of what New Delhi Leaders Declaration achieved, and this was also something in which the focus was on the real and serious concerns of the global south. He reminded everyone that this document was actually drafted taking into account the message of promoting strong and sustainable and balanced and inclusive growth in the world, which is only possible when there is cooperation from the global south. Now, you raise a very important question about the fact that who is opposing the role of the global south. And I would not say that there is opposition, but there is resistance for sure, because of the fact that if solutions have to be shaped on key issues of our present times, then some countries would like to keep this decision making in their own hands so that they're not in a position then to be forced to share what they have. And that is something which countries have realized after the COVID crisis in particular. For example, what is required is everyone's trust. And unless everybody works together on a trust basis, the problems which the world faces today cannot be solved. When there is a change in the natural order in the world, I think this is also something which the External Affairs Minister pointed out. There is a resistance there again for the greater role of the global south in shaping the solutions for the key issues. But if we have to take everybody along at the multilateral and plurilateral forums, then, his idea was that the shared interests of the emerging world order, they must be projected forcefully together by the global south. There should be a mitigation of vulnerabilities where certain countries concentrate economic power within themselves. And that has to be done so that the basic necessities can be available to countries in terms of need and in terms of crisis. And for that, that is only possible if we democratize and diversify our production, we build resilient and reliable supply chains, promote local solutions, etc., etc. And that is why the role of the African Union, in particular in the G20, becomes more than important because of the voice it gives to 1.4 billion people of Africa.
Professor Singh, very quickly, last question. In his remarks, Prime Minister Modi also called for cooperation under the framework of 5 Cs, which he explained as consultation, cooperation, communication, creativity, and capacity building to move forward. How do you see it? And the second quick question is, in fact, how do you see the overall atmosphere in the second Voice of Global South summit? Because 130 countries actually were present at the summit. The first one was attended by leaders from around 125 countries, but in the second summit, leaders from around 130 countries are participating. So what is the big message coming out of the second Voice of Global South summit hosted by India?
Thank you, Manas. You partly answered your question yourself. If in the first Voice of the Global South we saw 125 countries and the second one we are seeing 130, it means there is a clear endorsement of India's leadership of the Global South and how India is engaging itself in taking their issues and their perspectives to the high table of G21 summit meeting. So that's a clear endorsement of India's efforts being appreciated by all these countries. Second, about the 5 Cs that you mentioned, the Prime Minister mentioned how consultation, cooperation, communication, creativity, and capacity building will be used as instruments fundamentally to what he said, rectifying structural inequalities. And structural inequalities is something that are deeply ingrained in the system. You could go back as far as to Industrial Revolution, middle of 19th century, but more recently, for example, the industrialized Western countries, the G7 countries had largely created a template of globalization, which was profit-driven, market-driven, and has led to rapid industrialization, urbanization, and there we have the climate crisis, which is the most potent existential crisis for not just human race, but entire planet Earth. And today, even experts have stopped talking about keeping the median temperatures of our planet to 1.5. They are now talking of 2 degrees Celsius. That shows irreversibility of what has happened. And now more recently, as you see rise of countries like China and India, these Western countries have started following more protectionist policies to ensure that their level of development is not undermined by development of other countries. So it's a kind of fundamental structural problem, and structural inequalities is what needs to be addressed. And that is where issues of vulnerability of Global South, whether in Ukraine crisis or during the pandemic or during the Israel-Hamas crisis, becomes far more accentuated. And that is what Prime Minister is saying. You have to devise strategies which are enduring and sustainable. And therefore, 5 Cs are being sort of suggested as a way to rectify that structural inequalities that have crept into the system over a period of time. And therefore, now I think India is trying to make it, as we say, sustainable and inclusive kind of world order in which the decisions that are made are implementable and they are effective, and therefore we can begin to address some of the shared global problems. And therefore, repeatedly underlining that world is one, it is one family, it has one future, is to underline that we have shared planet. Blue planet is our shared planet, and all our challenges are shared, and therefore all our approach must be holistic in addressing some of the challenges. And that means not just the developed rich countries of global north, but also global south should be equal partners. And that is the direction in which India is trying to make its own contribution.
Ambassador Wadhwa and Professor Singh, thank you so very much for a detailed perspective on India's hosting of the second Global South Summit, as well as India's overall priorities in the G20 as its president. Thank you so very much.
Thank you so much.
You were listening to a discussion on Voice of Global South Summit, the successful outcomes of G20 Summit 2023. The participants were Anil Wadhwa, former diplomat, Professor Swarn Singh from JNU, and Manash Pratim Bhuyan, journalist. This program was produced and presented by the News Services Division of Akashvani. You can listen to it on a mobile app, News on AIR. This program is also available on a YouTube channel, News on AIR Official. You may share your feedback about this program through email at airnsdtalks@gmail.com or WhatsApp on 9289094044.